You probably know me from the papers, obviously, as the former MI5 officer. Many people know that I blew the whistle on MI5 and MI6, but not many people actually know really the detail of what happened. And I've got to say, my own personal story in all of this really is an eye-opener, I think. I went into the intelligence services with good intentions. I was not a typical kind of person who went into the services because I didn't go to public school or Oxford or Cambridge. I did go to university. I went to the University of Dundee. And prior to the 1990s, they would not have let people like me into the services. People who didn't come from the right background. In fact, I actually come from North East England. I come from Middlesbrough, obviously a very unfashionable place. So basically, I went in there really with the knowledge of civil liberties from another side. I'd actually been a journalist and I'd done some activism in the 1980s, so a very unlikely choice in many ways. And what astounded me first when I was in the services was really the inability to stop attacks. And I actually believe this is part of what we call false flag terrorism. It's in fact letting attacks happen to create the climate of fear, to create the climate in which people are happy to have their liberties in a democratic society compromised, and also to create a greater awareness of the need for MI5 to have its budget, basically. If MI5 stopped all the attacks, people might start saying, what the hell are we paying them for? So I want to take you through first, and this is what I'm going to do today, I'm going to take you through first a couple of examples of how they failed to stop attacks, and to give you an idea of just how incompetent they were, not just in terms of the initial incompetency of letting these things happen, but also the incompetency in not correcting the mistakes once they were pointed out. Then I'm going to talk about false flag terrorism that I am a witness to. I'm here to bear witness. Nobody can accuse me of being a conspiracy theorist because I was briefed on an operation in which MI6 funded Al-Qaeda. And after that, I want to touch a bit on 9/11 and on 7/7 and why there's an increasing body of evidence showing that these attacks are anything but what we think actually happened that day. And in fact, I'm going to say to you now, I'm not going to mince my words, I'm going to tell you, 9/11 was an inside job. On current available intelligence and evidence, I also believe that 7/7 was an inside job as well. And obviously, after I finish speaking, I'll allow some time for questions, because as I say, I've got nothing to hide. I will gladly answer any questions you have so we can try and get at the truth. So I joined MI5 in the early 1990s. The reason I joined was I was attracted to serving my country. In fact, during the recruitment process, it was quite peculiar because they didn't actually tell you what the job was. So I actually thought this was a job in journalism. I had actually been a journalist. In fact, I was a journalist at that point. I'd been running a small business, publishing a newspaper to students. I'd also been editor of my student newspaper at college. And because it sounded like a job in journalism, when they asked me, what have you done to change the world? I said, well, I stood up to the secret state. I published extracts of Spycatcher in the 1980s when it was under injunction. So if people remember Spycatcher, a book written by Peter Wright, a former MI5 officer. The book alleged that the intelligence services had tried to destabilise Harold Wilson's Labour government in the 1960s and 70s. And it also alleged that they would try to do this by branding Wilson as a KGB agent. So what I had, when I talked about this, I said, yes, I published this. I published to stand up the secret state to show that these people shouldn't be destabilising democratic government. And they asked me at the time, they said, what about the national security implications? And I kind of looked at them and thought, well, hang on, this book was published in Australia, published in America. I'm pretty sure that any terrorists who wanted to get information that would be useful to them would have gleaned it then, not in a small circulation newspaper in Dundee that went out to about 1,000 students, basically. So, of course, at the first interview, I didn't know what the job was. At the second interview, which took place in an unmarked building in London, they still wouldn't tell me what the job was. But as the interview went on, it became increasingly obvious. They kept asking me about the ethics of intelligence and giving me sort of either theoretical or practical examples of how you would deal with terrorism and so on. So after that, after about an hour and a half of this, they eventually said to me, why do you think you're here in an unmarked building in London? And I said, I don't know. And they said, come on, you're intelligent, you must know. And I said, it must be MI5. At that point, I had to sign the Official Secrets Act. And the next question they asked me, I know, you printed Spycatcher while it was under injunction. Why did you do that? And what about the implications for national security? But I was asked those questions all the way through the recruitment process. And in fact, I went through the recruitment process, and I have to be honest here, obviously I wanted to serve my country, but because I was nosy. I wanted to really know what went on at the heart of the intelligence services. And it was that I saw that shocked me the most. And in some ways what shocked me the most was the lack of professionalism and rigour when it came to actually stopping terrorist attacks. And to give you a very good example of this, I'm going to talk about a case that is in the public domain, so there's no issues of national security here. This comes from a book written by my partner called Spies, Lies and Whistleblowers. And it talks about a case of someone called Sean McNulty. Now, in 1993, we've been following him around for over 12 months. We believed at the time he was playing some kind of support role for the IRA in the British mainland, but we didn't have enough evidence to be able to put him on trial for anything. But on the 29th of May 1993, he went missing. Missing in suspicious circumstances. Because what he had done, as we learned from Telephone Intercept, is he'd taken his mother's car. This is highly unusual. He'd never used his mother's car before. But of course, what we believed, of course, was that he suspected his own car had been fitted with a tracking device. And of course, it had. So he went missing that day. The surveillance teams couldn't find him in any of his usual haunts in Newcastle and so on. Couldn't find him further afield. So it was highly suspicious that on the 29th of May 1993, he'd simply disappeared. Some days later, about 12 days later, on the 9th of June 1993, there were 2 attacks in the Newcastle area, which is where McNulty came from. Now, there's no evidence at this point to imply that he was a part of the attacks, but he's clearly the prime suspect because he was living in that area. The morning after, on the 10th of June, I was walking past my boss's desk, and on her desk, I saw a picture of my target, Sean McNulty. I hadn't been given it formally, but I saw it on the desk. So I said to my boss, what the hell's this doing here? And he says, oh, that comes from the target premises up in Scotland, where we're investigating Hugh Jack and Rab Friars. Now, Jack and Friars at this point were instrumental in leading the mainland campaign in Britain. That is, they were instrumental in actually organising the explosives and getting the bombs put down in our streets, the very people who were putting our lives at risk. Now, of course, when I looked at the picture, I wanted to see the date timeline. In the date timeline, 29th of May, 1993. This is why McNulty had taken his mother's car, basically. Now, of course, if those pictures had been passed on straight away, we would have had surveillance teams on McNulty immediately. That could have taken us to an arms cache, an explosives cache. Could have taken us to other members of the IRA. But because those pictures weren't passed on, we lost all of that intelligence. Now, I don't think I'm benefiting from hindsight when I say taking 12 days to pass on pictures in a fast-moving terrorist investigation is going to give an advantage to the IRA. That is not benefiting from hindsight. That is absolute common sense. Something went wrong here, and I've got to say we were very lucky because the bombs that were planted in the Newcastle area were put in a gas terminal and an oil terminal. And it was only good fortune that McNulty put the bomb a few yards away from a high-pressure pipe. If it had been next to the pipe, it would have ruptured it, and it would have taken down a whole row of terraced houses, killing hundreds of people. So it was only a fluke that MI5 got away with not being responsible for the deaths of many, many people. So basically, I obviously established this was McNulty. And what I wanted to find out, of course, was why had it taken 12 days to pass on these photographs? I mean, after all, this was 1993. There wasn't internet then. It was also an era, of course, when newspapers had passed photographs over wires for many, many decades. Yet I found out that MI5, who was supposed to be monitoring fast-moving terrorist targets, used to have a little van that used to go up to Scotland and go around all the special branches collecting the secure material. In this case, it would call in at the target premises and take the tape off the CCTV tapes. The problem was it only went up there once every 2 weeks. So that's why it had taken 12 days for these pictures to finally get back to MI5 HQ. Now, you wouldn't believe you could make this up. But I've got to say, when I was in MI5, people think of them being very technical, very good with computers. An organisation charged with the gathering, analysis and dissemination of intelligence in 1996 did not have an IT office management system. Can you believe that? Everything's written out on bits of paper by hand, handed to secretaries for typing up and so on, all of which, of course, slowed down the process of actually investigating the targets, basically. Anyway, nobody actually seemed to want to take responsibility for this delay either, or, in fact, to actually correct the situation, to make sure it didn't happen again. I became very frustrated by this, because I raised it with my bosses in the service and said, this simply isn't good enough. People are going to die if we keep making mistakes like this. And they looked at me and basically told me to shut up. So I thought, what I'll do is I will alert people outside the service when it comes to writing the formal brief about this operation. So I did. I made it very clear in the brief that these pictures had been taken 12 days before the attacks, but they hadn't arrived until after the attacks in the service. So as intelligence, they could have been brilliant, but they were in fact absolutely useless. And the first addressee of this brief, would you believe, was HMQ, Her Majesty the Queen. The second addressee is the Prime Minister, the third the Foreign Secretary, and so on. So it's going out to some of the top people in Britain in government. Now when these briefs go out to service, they're copied back to the person who's written them, so they know they've gone out. And when I got mine back that had been copied, I actually found that my brief had been changed by my boss. Now I checked my version was absolutely correct. His version made it appear that these pictures were taken on the 10th of June, the day after the attacks. So that is a complete lie designed to cover up their embarrassment, nothing to do with national security. This again gives you an insight into how the intelligence services can lie to the democratic representatives. And I think when we heard the earlier speaker, we were talking about this earlier on. This is what the intelligence services do. They lie to democratic elected politicians, and the politicians think they're telling the truth, and they think that we are the people who are making things up or lying, not the intelligence services. So that gives you a very clear example of how MI5 was not really trying to stop the IRA. To give you another example of this, I was part of the team that in fact took over MI5 responsibility for investigating the IRA, and we took over from the Metropolitan Police Special Branch. Now when we took over, MI5 had not incorporated the Met's records into its own. That meant in every investigation, every time a target came up, we had to go across to the Met, go and look through their records and find out what that person had done previously. Now again, this slowed down every investigation. But crucially, we were also forced to write warrants. Warrants are the things that justify a phone tap. They go to the Home Secretary so he can give his permission for a phone to be tapped. We were forced to apply for warrants using outdated information on outdated targets. In some cases, the information was inaccurate. And yet we had to put that up to government to apply for these telephone taps. And this, I stress, was at the expense of investigating the up-to-date targets. Now, if you look, sometimes it's very difficult, obviously, to know what's going on in the intelligence services. But you can tell that I'm telling the truth here, because from October 1992 to about April 1993, which is after the first 6 months when MI5 had taken over, there were more IRA bombs put down on the British mainland at a greater rate than any time before or since. And that was deliberate. That was because MI5 management was stopping MI5 officers like me trying to stop the IRA. And to give you an idea of how strongly people felt in MI5 about this at my level, we banded together and complained to management until we continued our line of complaint. Now, of course, in MI5, there are no trade unions. You have no employment rights. So when they say to you, we can ruin your career, there is no legal redress. There's no employment tribunals. There's no one you can appeal to. So it's a very, very chilling and very sobering comment that they make to you. And of course, we've all got to pay our rent. So we kind of step back and accept this stuff. Now, of course, seeing things like that go wrong is a major problem. But it's not one that would make you change your life. As time went on in the service, I saw more and more things going wrong. I saw how MI5 and MI6 had conspired to allow a Libyan terrorist to come and live in Britain. And he'd been allowed to set up a terrorist network in this country. And again, if you don't believe me, this is now in a document on the internet you can get from somewhere called cryptome.org, in which MI5 admit, in the document in which they expel this Libyan terrorist, a man called Khalifa Bazelia, they admit he has set up a terrorist network that is there for Libyans to use if they wish to resume hostilities against the UK. At the same time, MI5 had also investigated a Guardian journalist on the basis of very flimsy and inaccurate information. Now again, with all of this stuff, no one has actually died as such. There was no loss of human life. However, in September 1995, I was briefed on an MI6 operation. I'll just tell you very briefly what this operation was. MI6 funded Al-Qaeda to carry out an operation to assassinate Colonel Gaddafi. That operation went wrong and killed innocent civilians. Now, I just want to say about this, some people, obviously when I first blew the whistle on this, said that the innocent civilians in Libya who died were collateral damage. Now, I don't think like that. I think these people are innocent human beings who were killed in a terrorist act funded by the British intelligence services. They are at fault there. Let's not believe these James Bond myths and so on. Killing innocent people only leads to more terrorism. We've seen this with the invasion of Afghanistan, the invasion of Iraq, what's going on in Lebanon at the moment. These do not stop terrorism. As we'll all see, the war on terrorism is not a war on terrorism. It is designed to create more terrorism, to create more fear amongst the British population, so they'll be more willing to accept laws that we would never have dreamed of accepting 10 years ago. Situations in which the intelligence services are now going out to countries like Pakistan and standing outside the door while people are tortured. Now, let's be absolutely clear about this. Torture does not work. If you could say it did work, you could create a moral argument. You could say by torturing that one man, we could save 100 or 1,000. And that's morally right. But torture does not work. And I know this again from working in the services. The reason it doesn't work is that any trained terrorist is trained to give false names, false stories, false information to make the torture stop. Anybody who's not a terrorist, of course, will say anything at the time to make the torture stop. So this information is useless. Yet by using this information, MI5 and MI6 are encouraging the practice of torture. And let's face it, if we are to be moral people and a moral nation, to be involved in torture is worse than to be involved in killing people, because it is about sustained suffering of another human being. Killing them with a bullet to the head, it's all over, it's swift. It's wrong, but it's all over and swift. Torture is about darkness, it's about suffering, it's about creating that climate of fear amongst innocent people, amongst innocent Muslims mainly. So back to the point of this. In September 1995, my opposite number in MI6, a guy called David Watson, I'm not giving anything away here, his name's in the public domain, I didn't put it there, but it is there. He came to me and said that they'd had what is known as a walk-in, or a volunteer, to the British Embassy in Tunis. And he'd given a story to the resident MI6 officer there about how he had a group of Islamic extremist terrorists he was going to lead in a coup in Libya in which they were going to assassinate Colonel Gaddafi. Now let's be clear about some things here. One, as soon as Watson told me he was leading a group of Islamic extremists, Tunworth, this agent in Libya, I said, hang on, what's going on? MI5 have just set up a section to deal with this threat. We knew this was the new big threat to British lives. At the same time, we were also painfully aware that Colonel Gaddafi had renounced terrorism. So again, there is no moral argument here about killing Gaddafi to save other lives. He has stopped the terrorism. And yet we're giving money to people who pose a direct threat to British lives. Again, that cannot make any sense. We are putting the British public at great risk for an operation whose objective will not save any British lives. It doesn't make any sense at all. And I was actually extremely surprised as well when Watson admitted to me before Christmas 1995 that they'd paid $40,000 to this man. And again, let's be clear, without this money, they could not have carried out the operation. They need to buy guns, they need to buy jeeps, they need to buy tents. So it's not as if this money was some kind of add-on. It went to the very heart of enabling this operation to happen. Now, about the same time, 5th of December 1995, MI6 did put out a document to Whitehall about this attack, or intended attack, in fact. Now, people say, well, if it's an MI6 conspiracy, why did they alert Whitehall to it? Well, they did because they had to tell the people in Whitehall there was going to be a coup in Libya. If they didn't, Whitehall would turn around and say, well, why didn't you know about this? You failed to gather the intelligence. Of course, they didn't mention the payments. This was pre the payments. But what the report crucially did mention was that this was not simply someone in MI6 reporting on an operation. This was someone, an MI6 agent, who was involved in the operation, involved at the very heart of it. It confirmed that he was leading a group of Islamic extremists. And also the report, because it predates the attack, detailed the modus operandi that was to be used. And that was that the group were going to infiltrate Gaddafi's security entourage and then plant either a bomb or a grenade underneath the car, basically. Now, I've got to say, I didn't do more to stop this. I've got to be honest here. Because at this point, MI6 on many, many occasions had come up with various crackpot schemes. I mean, they really did think they were living either in a Boy's Own world or a James Bond world, basically. They really did. So, I didn't really do as much. I mean, I raised it certainly with my boss in MI5 and said, look, I don't think they've got permission for this attack. Now, this is a vital component of the legality of what the services do. The real James Bonds do have a license to kill. People might find that quite surprising. They do have a license to kill, but only if they've got the permission of the Foreign Secretary for that assassination operation. If they don't have the permission, they are subject to the laws of the land in the same way that you or I are if we get involved in murdering people. And that is very important, because if no politician in the cabinet knows about the operation, it has no democratic legitimacy. It is simply MI6 officers having the power of life or death over anybody they want, because they carry out these operations in secret. The Foreign Secretary knows about these things. At least he is notionally accountable to Parliament, which is notionally accountable to the people. I'm not pretending we live in a particularly good democracy, but at least there is some accountability there. Whereas if they do this in secret and the government don't know, there is no accountability at all. Now, Malcolm Rifkin, the Foreign Secretary of the day, has said very clearly on the record he gave no permission for this operation, so it is a crime. So I was sitting by my desk in March 1996, and I have to say, by this time, I'd already decided to leave the service. The very fact that MI6 were involved in this plot and they paid money to the coup plotter, to me, was wrong. I was in the services to stop terrorism, not be part of people who are creating more suffering in the world and more violence and terrorism. And I read a report, or in fact I read two GCHQ reports, and they both described a plot in which Gaddafi's security entourage had been infiltrated, in which a bomb or a grenade had been put under a car to try and assassinate Gaddafi in a cavalcade of cars. But they got the wrong car. Now, this would be funny if innocent people hadn't died, basically. But they got the wrong car. And I made sure that this was absolutely the plot they were talking about, that this was MI6's man Tunworth. Someone who we believe is someone called Abdullah Radwan, who has been captured by the Libyans and we believe executed as a result of his role in the plot. He is now dead. We were told to try and take his name out of a book we wrote about this by the services, and we said, no, this is public domain. The Libyans have announced it, so it's staying in. And they had to accept that, basically, and you can now read that in my partner Annie Mashon's book, basically. And when I raised this with David Watson at our next meeting, he went, yes, that was our man. We did it. Instead, I pointed out to him, you didn't do it. The objective of the operation was to assassinate Colonel Gaddafi. He's still alive. You didn't meet the objective, and what's more, innocent people died. We can have no claim to legitimacy in fighting terrorism if we are part of it. I mean, imagine it had been the other way around. Imagine this had been the Libyans funding the IRA to assassinate Tony Blair. God forbid. And they killed innocent people in the Mall, waving their plastic Union Jacks. No one in the British media would turn around and say, well, that's collateral damage, so it's all fine. And we'd have headlines about how barbaric the Libyan regime was, and quite rightly. But when we do it, we cannot pretend we're the good guys and the heroes. When we do it, we are equally barbaric. Now, this, to say, was why I left the services, basically. I'd already decided to leave at that point, but that really was the kind of the straw that broke the camel's back. I left. It took me some time before I had the courage to go on the record. But I did in August 1997. Unfortunately, the Mail on Sunday newspaper who did the story chickened out of publishing this information about how MI6 had funded Al-Qaeda. You've also got to bear in mind at this point in 1997 that unless you worked in the intelligence services, you would not have heard of Al-Qaeda. You would not realise the threat. Ironically, it was only as a result of what happened in 9/11 that people suddenly looked back at my information and thought, my God, what the hell were they doing funding Al-Qaeda? These people who are, in theory, of course, capable of carrying out an attack like 9/11. I also got some fascinating insight into what happens in this country when you stick your head above the parapet. The mentality of the British middle classes who went to public school in Oxbridge is that a good chap stays quiet about things. That's what a good chap does. That's the honourable thing to do. Well, I'm sorry. That's not the honourable thing to do when innocent people have been murdered. No one would say that if your next-door neighbour was murdered and you knew who'd done it. No one would say, keep quiet, old chap, that's the honourable thing to do. No, you'd say, go to the police and report it. Now, I couldn't report this to the police because the Official Secrets Act stopped me. If I'd gone to the police, it would have been a criminal offence. I couldn't go to the government either. That would have been a criminal offence. And this is why I went directly to the media, which is also a criminal offence, but at least it gave me some protection and made sure that more people knew about this. Well, that was the theory, as I say. The Mail on Sunday didn't actually publish the story. And I have to say as well, coinciding with something else that people might want to ask questions about later, the death of Princess Diana. We had a week in the limelight, in the press, knocking at the intelligence services, releasing bits of information about how they'd failed to stop attacks and so on. On the Saturday night, the government took out an injunction. I was delighted, because that was my plan. I knew they'd take out an injunction, and I knew the press would be irate. And sure enough, they were. Saturday night, it was going to be the Sunday papers. There's no other news on Saturday. We were news across the world because MI5 and MI6 had banned a former officer from talking about their crimes and misdemeanours. So I went to bed that night thinking, mission almost accomplished. Got up the next morning, put on a documentary, put on the French telly, and there was a documentary on. I've lived in France before, so I understand French. And the documentary ended with the words, Princess Diana died today. I just stopped and thought, that's it. We're stuffed. We'll get no publicity. We're out on a limb now. And indeed, that is what happened. There was nothing else in the British papers what seemed like weeks. We were forgotten. Now, I'm not saying the services bumped off Princess Diana just to keep us quiet. But if you were planning to bump off Princess Diana because she was pregnant with the child of Dodi Al-Fayed, and they could never tolerate a Muslim half-brother to their king, this would be a very, very good time to do it. And that's what I believed happened. They had the plans in place, and they brought those plans forward as a way of knocking us out of the headlines. And but of course, after that, I was still on the run in France. The authorities didn't know where I was. One of the great things, of course, about being in the service is you know how to avoid detection. So you managed to stay undetected for 10 months. And then I went up to Paris. I wanted to submit my story to the government, the story about MI6 funding Al-Qaeda. So I did. I submitted to the Blair government. Now, many people, of course, at this point were still seeing Blair with rose-tinted spectacles. Didn't realise quite how bad he was. And I don't think that either. I thought when he saw this information, he'd be duty-bound to act. Let's face it, I'm giving information about the intelligence services in Britain, which is supposed to be a democracy, operating outside of any democratic control, wasting taxpayers' money, and killing innocent people without a good reason. That should be dynamite. That should lead to the intelligence services and the secrecy within which they work being reformed. Instead, Blair did not call in the police to investigate the murderers and the terrorists in MI6. He had me arrested in France. They put out an urgent extradition request. I was picked off the streets, banned from seeing a lawyer for 48 hours, banned from having visitors for 2 months, but kept in a French prison. Now, fortunately, I had an insurance policy given an interview to the BBC. I gave an interview to Mark Urban, a very prestigious correspondent within the BBC who's highly respected. I did it for the eventuality of being arrested in these circumstances, but also for the eventuality of me just disappearing or dying in suspicious circumstances. And that was shown. In fact, this is the old days when the BBC had some balls and used to stand up for the government and did essentially what we pay our licence fee for, to stop the tyranny of government, to stop the tyranny of the intelligence services. And they stood up to them and they showed a panorama special on the Friday evening, Friday the 7th of August, 1998. 2 days later, Robin Cook, who was then the Foreign Secretary, went on the Breakfast with Frost programme and said, this is pure fantasy with no basis in fact. Now, how would he know that at that point? This is 36 hours after this broadcast has been shown. Clearly, all the intelligence officers are at home at the weekend. He hasn't had time even to check with them. What he has done, of course, is gone to the head of MI6, who has sought to deny it. Now, I'm sure Cook made a political calculation here. And that political calculation was that it's so difficult to get information out of the intelligence services in Britain that this will never happen. There'll be no comeback on me. And of course, I'm sacrificing a whistleblower abroad, but who cares about that? Who cares? It's just some whistleblower. But he got it wrong. There was a principled person within, don't know where they came from actually, we don't know where they came from, but certainly a principled person, put the documents on the internet that MI6 had sent out to Whitehall in December 1995. To recap, this tells us an MI6 agent is involved in a plot to assassinate Gaddafi. It tells us he is leading a group of Islamic terrorists. It predates the plot and also tells us about the modus operandi, clearly showing, therefore, inside knowledge. It's not somebody who sees an operation and thinks, well, I'll try and blame him. It's somebody involved who knows what's going to happen in future. So this is pretty good proof. This is the refutation that this is pure fantasy. This is the basis, in fact, for what I am saying. Yet to this day, in the fashion of the novel 1984, if you phone the Foreign Office and say, what about Shayler's allegations about MI6 funding Al-Qaeda, they will still turn around to you and say, this is pure fantasy with no basis in fact. Even though the same day as that interview by Robin Cook, the 9th of August 1998, the Mail on Sunday had two sources in America confirm that payments had been made to Islamic terrorists from MI6. These people were not on the record, but they wouldn't be. They'd be scared to go on the record in case they were persecuted. But that was crucial confirmation of what I was saying. Again, tried to get the police to investigate this because the government would do nothing. I wrote lots and lots of letters to them. They didn't want to know, basically. And in March 2000, my partner Annie Mashon took a statement that I'd written for the police that I said I'm prepared to swear to. The police then turned round to us and said, no crime has been committed in Britain. The last time I looked, conspiracy to murder, aiding and abetting murder, funding murder, are all criminal offences in Britain. So we have to go back to the police and argue this. Now, I believe this 6 months gave a crucial edge to the intelligence services. That 6 months enabled them to cover their tracks, to get rid of the evidence that was incriminating. Now, anybody who finds that fanciful, just say to anybody else. If you said to somebody, we're going to investigate you for murder in 6 months because you're the suspect, and we're only starting in 6 months' time, what do you expect that person to do if there's evidence of the murder around? Keep it there in his bedroom or destroy it? Of course they're going to destroy it. And that's what they did. The police operation investigation started 6 months after that. Crucially, they did recover material. Crucially, I was never charged with perjury or wasting police time. Of course, no one was ever charged with this. But what do we expect? And it's the chaps in the intelligence services. The laws don't seem to apply to them in the same way they apply to us. They're the ones who say they're doing it in the interest of the country. They weren't doing this in the interest of the country, otherwise they would have cleared it with the Foreign Secretary. But that's the way the system works in Britain. We also have like a two-tier system. If you're on the inside of that elite, you can do anything and get away with it. If you're outside that, no matter what you do, you will be prosecuted. So I hope that gives you a very clear insight into the fact that the intelligence services were knowingly prepared to fund our terrorist enemies. There can be no argument, as there was with Saddam and with bin Laden, both of whom have, of course, been funded by MI6 and the CIA. They can say in that case, at least, our enemy's enemy is our friend. At that point, of course. But in those cases, of course, the chickens came home to roost. The two greatest threats to our democracy and liberty came from Saddam, and in theory, from Al-Qaeda. I say in theory from Saddam, in theory from Al-Qaeda. But there was none of that to say, because they knew MI5 had identified Islamic extremism as the new main threat. It also demonstrates, of course, how the government will not investigate claims like that. They will lie on the part of the intelligence services. And how police investigations will be held up so the intelligence services are never found guilty of anything.